Johnny Carson was the biggest star in America. Movie stars, rock stars. I don't think anybody was bigger than Johnny because he was on night after night after night.
Johnny Carson ruled late-night TV with a sharp wit and smooth charm that millions adored. For 3 decades, a lot of people loved Johnny Carson's sharp wit and smooth charm, which made him the queen of late-night TV. For 30 years, he turned tense situations into laughs and difficult guests into gold. Most of the time. However, even the strong king had his limits. Behind the scenes, some stars irritated him so much that it caused problems off-air. Some people hold grudges for a long time, and some are never invited back. Who was it that made Johnny Carson so shaky that he still knew their names at age 79? Let's look at all 8 of them. 8. Frank Sinatra. Jack Carson was a master of calm, cool on the outside, sharp on the inside, and always ready with a quick save. That is until Frank Sinatra. When Carson came into the picture, even his famously strong hold on The Tonight Show could become a little shaky. Frank didn't just get to NBC studios, he went down. His team got ahead by making changes. Making sure the room is cool enough, setting up teleprompters, and saving room for up to a dozen of his friends stood off to the side of the stage. NBC security didn't just log him in, as if getting ready for a royal visit, they wrote his arrival in big, bold letters. Carson, fans of clean and predictable events, knew what was going to happen. It was time for the show, Sinatra style. Johnny knew how important a good guest was, but he also knew that hosting wasn't just having guests. About who was sitting in the chair, it was about timing, balance, and being in charge. But Sinatra, he had his own rhythm. He made it clear when something didn't work for him. Whether it was a junior producer was reportedly led out by a bodyguard, and the name came from a lighting cue. Frank knew how to tell the team about things he didn't like. Carson, who was always a gentleman on screen, people might laugh it off, but the stress was clear when they were alone. His helpers saw it. On those nights, he'd pour himself an extra scotch and make half-jokes like, "Chairman of the board, that's true, but I still sign the network's checks." That was one of the most memorable moments. 1976, during his monologue, Carson was in the middle of a joke about a peanut allergy when he walked onto the stage with his arm around Johnny's shoulder. The crowd erupted. 40 seconds of roaring cheers. Carson looked through it quickly, then turned and joked, Frank, do you need the whole show?" Sinatra gave a wink. It was famous, only until the band packs up. It electricity. It made Carson crazy. From home, it looked like it happened on its own, it's even cute. Johnny thought it was a clear flex, though. There was holy ground in the monologue, where the host decided how the night would go. But Sinatra had just taken a piece of it without any warning. Johnny thought it wouldn't be the last time he did something like that because he had done it before. Still, Carson never let the stress show on air. He would introduce Sinatra with real warmth, lead the interviewee to talk about safe memories, like the Rat Pack or old shows, being careful to avoid landmines like political fights, mob rumors, or Sinatra's troubled love life. A lot of people watched every time. Of course, Carson's blood pressure went up too. Carson really did know what Sinatra brought to the table: buzz, prestige, or a sense of what's going on. He wasn't going to waste that on a few problems backstage. Even though everyone was smiling and applauding, a quiet war was going on. One Johnny wanted to honor the legend in some way. One of them had to run a show. And even though Carson was the king of late-night TV, Frank Sinatra's voice was sometimes so powerful that I had to bow down to it, even if only for a moment. Johnny finally dealt with it the only way he knew how, with style, wit, and the "you should know that not all legends follow the rules." If that name surprised you, wait until you see who else made the list. 7th, Chevy Chase. Johnny Carson was the best at making people feel comfortable and running interviews with humor. charm and the right amount of power. But not everyone sitting next to him did. Fits right into the rhythm of The Tonight Show. Chevy was one guest who often threw off the balance. Chase. A lot of people knew Chase as the big comedic star from Saturday Night Live, and the Carson saw something different behind the smirks and sarcasm in the 97s. It wasn't just Chase who was well known. Carson often had big names with even bigger crowds. Egos. The way Chase carried his fame around with him was hard. The way he makes jokes lacked the warmth Carson looked for in his guests and spoke with a deadpan tone and biting sarcasm. People watched hoping for funny banter and light-hearted teasing, but when Chase was in the chair, the room's mood often became dull or awkward. His blows didn't hit like friendly jokes. They seemed personal and even mean. Carson, who learned how to make his own when the mood changed, it was hard for guests to look good and still get laughs. He knew how to dance with smart people, but he didn't like being the center of attention. Into a one-man show, especially one that seemed to question his role as host. That's what Chase often made predictions. Even if it was just a little, his cocky swagger made it clear that he wasn't there to just fit in, he was there to be the star. There were rumors around NBC that Carson watched he saw the younger comedian as more than just annoying, he saw him as someone who could compete with him. Chase, in the end, wasn't afraid to talk about his goals. He became famous very quickly as one of the first faces of Saturday Night Live. People knew her name, and for a while, some in the business thought she might take over for late-night TV shows. Carson, who had made The Tonight Show what it was, didn't like that idea. A nightly event, and he didn't like it when people used his stage as a stepping stone. Carson never said anything bad about Chase in public, but people close to the couple said they didn't get along. Their conversations were not as fun as those of other guests. When the cameras stopped rolling, the gap got bigger. In a world where respect for time, tone, and each other shaped every successful segment, Chase only slowed things down. This is for Carson, the master of some guests weren't worth the trouble on smooth television. What, though, kept the next guest quiet? What scares Carson more than Chevy Chase's ego is his calmness. Don't move from your screen. 6. Fred Rogers. If Carson's patience was put to the test by Chevy Chase, then Fred Rogers quietly took apart his beat. Chase brought too much pride to the Tonight Show. Mr. Rogers didn't bring any, but that didn't make Johnny Carson feel better. It should have been a safe reservation. The idea seemed great on paper. Pair late night smartest host with the friendliest man on TV. Even the show memo said there would be a 5-minute light break. A few puppets, but nothing too heavy. But as soon as Fred Rogers walked into the studio, the whole tone changed. He didn't rush onto the stage or ride the wave of cheers like some people do. Most of the guests. He walked across the stage, stopped in the middle, and said, "Thank you very much, friends." The crowd clapped, not sure if he meant what he said. That was done. The crew rushed to start the applause, but it took a long time. How long? The unnoticeable pulse that kept Carson's show going like a clock skipped a beat. Johnny tried to make things better. When he lifted his foot, a pair of white shoes caught his eye. Sneakers. He smiled and said, "Fred, I wore these in honor of you." Fred smiled and put his hands together softly and said, "That's very kind of you, Johnny. Running shoes can get us ready to play." The people in the studio laughed politely while they waited for the host to respond. No one said anything, though. Rogers really did mean what he said. No funny ending. No setting up. Just being kind. And it felt like a full stop when I saw late-night TV. Carson quickly changed his mind and asked for funny fan mail stories and maybe a funny moment with the kids. Rogers wasn't funny just to make people laugh, though. He told a short story about a kid who was scared of bathtub drains and how play can help kids deal with their fears. A better understanding. His words were spaced out like lullabies, and each sentence hit hard and clear. Great for little kids. It's not good for 11:45 p.m. But behind the scenes, the hands on the stopwatch moved. With nerves. It looked like the carefully planned monologue and jokes were not going together. Cue cards had jokes scratched off of them. The directors made the camera shots wider to fill the screen. And Carson was sitting there politely nodding while sweating under his collar. He was one of the best in the business. It was clear that making fun of Fred Rogers was against the rules. He was too pure to be around, too much respect. It might have looked mean to treat him like any other guest. But Carson, besides, he couldn't fully engage him like he would with a fast-talking actor or a crazy comedian. The usual nonsense didn't work. The beat was off. People at home thought of the silence as warmth. Helpers behind the curtain thought it was panic. Carson let out a sigh when the commercial finally played. Hard, clearly happy. The folks on the ship called it a pacing disaster. Nielsen tells us showed a clear drop during Rogers' segment. They really did use hand clickers for laugh counters. To keep track of laughs, recorded less than half as many as the animal show the night before. A bit. How did it go? A sweet part that moves slowly. Still, something strange happened. Afterwards the show's mailroom was full to the brim. Hundreds of letters written by hand came in, many from parents who had never stayed up late before but did so that night because their kids made them. They weren't happy with the jokes. They thanked The Tonight Show for giving Mr. Rogers a chance to talk. Possible. A place at the table for adults. Longtime producer for Carson, Fred de Cordova, thought of it as a trade-off. We gained goodwill, he said, but not momentum. So changes were made. Then came. The next time Rogers came out, it was during the busy holiday season in December. Less harsh and more nostalgic. Carson's opening monologue was cut down by 2 jokes to give people room to breathe. Rogers was told to bring props like his little red trolley, a puppet, or 2, so Johnny could play off of them. And even so, behind the scenes, the still there. In case the pace slowed down, the directors kept a musical act warm up in the wings. Carson always kept a good attitude. He would sincerely thank Fred, shake his hand, and walk away with a smile on his face. But one time, after a very soft part, he leaned over to a stage manager and whispered, "Next time, hire him after a stand-up, not before." After that, Daddy needs coffee. After many years, when privately asked which guest had been the hardest to talk to, not the most difficult, but the hardest, Carson is said to have smiled and said, "Fred Rogers. Great guy. But that was the only time I looked at both the time and my pulse at the same time." Chevy Chase's ego got to be too much for Carson, but Fred Rogers' silence calmed him down. And something honest, and a little awkward, came out in the silence. 2 stories. They were both brilliant, kind, and completely out of sync, but they were on the same stage. But what do you do when a master of improv has to follow someone else's script? Watch this space to find out who comes next. Number 5. Bob Hope. Bob Hope has been thought of as NBC's crown jewel for a long time. He didn't just bring charm to The Tonight Show, he also brought a fully loaded script. His group, always one step ahead, would send thick envelopes with jokes, interview questions, and camera directions days before he showed up. Carson was a man who loved natural brilliance and organic laughs, was held back and turned into a cue card operator in his own home. Hope didn't look at them while they talked. He fixed his eyes on the cue cards. Hidden behind the cameras, ready to fire as soon as Carson fed him the next line. use a ready-made punchline. Even when Carson changed the subject and asked a question out of the blue, Hope didn't move. He just blinked, shuffled his cards, and told the joke exactly as it was written, ignoring the new direction at all costs. People in the audience laughed because they always do, but there wasn't any spark. Behind his desk, Carson was so angry that the pencil he was holding was shaking in his hand. Carson didn't like the forced rhythm, he also didn't like how much they promoted it. Wishes rarely told a personal story or brought up a new memory. Instead, every visit turned into an ad. During he talked about Texaco 3 times in less than 10 minutes at a show in 1978. Carson, Texaco gets more airtime than I do, he joked, trying to save face. It made people laugh. But everyone in the room could tell that he was tired by the sound of his voice. One employee recalled hearing him say, "I'm the warm-up act for a corporate sponsorship," behind the scenes. Things were even worse because Hope wasn't just a visitor, he was staying there. Weather or NBC kept calling him back, even when he didn't have anything new to say. He got older people to watch, his specials brought in a lot of money. Whenever Carson tried to cut down on Hope's appearances and executives gently reminded him who was in charge of keeping the lights on with newer, fresher comedians. Carson finally gave in, but only under certain conditions. After that, Hope's visits were planned ahead of time. Buffered. Producers planned for a musical act or a more casual guest to come next, someone who could bring life back into the room. It was still tense, though. The staff saw every time Hope walked into the building, Carson's air would change. 10 degrees dropped in the dressing room. It wasn't stage fright that made you chill. It was an offer to quit. On screen, there wasn't a fight going on. They were nice. Carson laughed, Hope made a joke, these checks kept getting cashed by NBC. But anyone who paid close attention could see, behind Johnny's grin was always the same, a man waiting for time to run out. No matter how famous Hope was, his appearances on The Tonight Show showed that not each spotlight is right for a different icon. Hope's visits were great for Carson, who liked being spontaneous and having a soul. Went from being about connection to being more about duty. The beat wasn't right. The tune never not quite landed. That was huge for a host who did his best work when he could make things up on the spot. For Charlton Heston did not walk. He walked onto the stage of The Tonight Show like he was getting ready for a hearing in Congress. With a strong voice and the height of a Hollywood legend, he had not only the aura not only of Moses or Ben-Hur, but also of someone who was sure that every word he spoke belonged to in books about history. Because Johnny Carson made a lot of money with jokes and quick wit, having Heston over was more like running a symposium than having a guest over. When Carson asked, "Chuck, did you ever get hurt filming those crazy chariot scenes?" It wasn't often a simple yes or no answer. Heston would start from a long way away, riding horses as a child. He spent at Yale studying Shakespeare and the beauty of taking risks in performance, before moving toward the real story of the broken rib. After 5 minutes, the story finally came out. When it landed, but the studio band was already moving around, and Carson's it was getting hard for him to keep up his polite nods. Heston still couldn't do it even during commercial breaks. Turn off. He explained things he had said on air, gave historical context, and used ancient quotes. Texts, and even once told Carson he should go to the NRA museum. The audience, on the other hand, I was not sure if they were watching a talk show or a public speaking event. After one in 1987, producers counted the laughs and found only 9. Carson usually had 30 shots, so that was a big drop. The show needed to come to life. For that reason, they brought in Don Rickles right after Heston. Towles looked around at how sad it was, leaned into the mic, and asked, "Who died?" It was a hit. The crowd yelled. Carson took a deep breath of relief backstage and told Rickles in a low voice, "Always follow Moses with chaos," but Heston wasn't banned. He was managed. His segments were cut down to just 8 minutes by the producers. Just one epic story. No long political side trips. Don't start writing philosophical essays in the middle of a conversation. The aim was to keep the tone and pace light, even if it meant cutting the grandiose parts short. Carson didn't dislike Heston personally, he admired him as a movie star. Icon, but their chemistry on air was rough at best. Carson liked things to be spontaneous, the kind of casual back and forth that could make any guest interesting. Heston, on the other hand, brought with him the weight of a courtroom summary. He didn't care about jokes. Or jokey jabs. He made public statements. His presence made people quiet down, not laugh. There was also Heston's politics, which were never said out loud. By the late 1980s, his public support for the NRA and strong conservative views made him a lightning rod in, and the industry is moving to the left. Carson liked to throw soft blows to both sides without likely thought it would be easier to stay neutral than to get personal. Heston had strong beliefs. When Heston got angry at jokes that made him think, Carson backed off. Because he knew the laughs weren't worth the stress. Carson was polite in the end, but it was clear, Heston belonged on the silver screen. Which was all about drama, and Carson ran the stage, which was all about fun. Some guests brought I laughed. Others came with gifts. They rarely sat down together on the same couch together. Number 3, Wayne Newton, but not all fights happened. Some showed up without warning, dressed in Greek philosophy and polite disagreement. With a fury that only Vegas money could buy, he ripped his silk shirt open and clenched his fists. Johnny Carson interspersed his monologues with songs for months in the late 1970s and early 1980s. With Wayne Newton jokes. Those were the kinds of jabs that usually beat him. Laughs and says that Newton's thick hair needs photosynthesis under the lights of Las Vegas, or his flashy performance on stage. People in the crowd howled. Carson made a face. Newton, though, didn't. Different from other famous people who laughed it off or went along with it, Newton was upset and kept quiet. He wasn't just a lounge singer at the time, he was a star in Las Vegas. He had just spent a lot of money on the Aladdin Hotel, so any damage to his reputation wasn't important. Just personal, it had to do with money. Talk began to be said behind the velvet curtains of the Strip. Toller wasn't amused. He was mad. On the day of the recording in 1980, he ended his whisper. No warning, Newton took off and went through Burbank and walked right into NBC studios. He would later be seen walking on security footage. He walked down the hall like he was on a mission. His silk shirt was open, and his fists were clenched. His look was cold. Johnny Carson was sitting in his office and looking over his cue cards in silence. The door swung open, and Newton walked in before anyone could do anything. Fred de Cordova, who has been the stage manager for The Tonight Show for a long time, says that the room went silent. Toller leaned over the desk and said one sharp, calm sentence. "If you ever call me a joke again," he said, "I'll show you the gag." And he left. Carson didn't answer. He wasn't moving. For he just sat there in silence for almost a minute. Last, he let out a breath. Well, dang. That night, the writers quietly took out all of Newton's lines from the monologue. People who were safer, like politicians, airlines, and weather forecasters, made people laugh. The sharp sparkle. What did Carson stand for? Gone, at least when it came to Newton. The fight had hurt everyone. Insiders saw the change. The fearless late-night king who used to joke around without thinking twice now avoided one name. Carson didn't lack the guts to keep going, he just didn't know how. Knew what it would cost to bother someone who wouldn't play along. Newton wasn't a person. Actor looking for work on film. He had a lot of power, strong ties, and a clear breaking point. Wayne Newton didn't go back to The Tonight Show to make people laugh. It was under strict terms that were carefully worked out, no jokes before or after he showed up, and no veiled references to their past. Everything on stage looked nice and was painfully stiff. Though there was none of the easy banter Johnny Carson usually had with his guests. What had in this case, what used to be a place for kids to play had become a silent battlefield. The fight never made the front page of a tabloid, but it also never really went away. Carson, he was always the cool captain of late night, but that hallway moment stuck with him like a bruise. The outside. One of the few times the king of jokes was shut up because of something other than scandal. Not because of the ratings, but because of the man who refused to be the joke. In the end, Newton didn't need to speak out loud to get his pride back. Not even a hallway, a single word and a look that could cut through 1,000 laughs. Number 2. Joan Rivers. When Joan Rivers first showed up on It's So Exciting To, she said at the start of The Tonight Show in 1965, which made Johnny Carson laugh, "Come on in." My mom finally stopped crying. That sharp, silly humor was just what she needed. The things Carson loved. Rivers wasn't just a guest over the next 20 years, she became a regular. He eventually made her a regular guest host after inviting her on almost 100 times. Carson had never done that for anyone else, so it was a clear sign of trust and respect. Behind the scenes, Rivers never really cared about that bond. She wrote him birthday cards and notes by hand.